Anders Hayden hardly looks like a radical, but he is one. Radical means root. Radical questions go to the roots of the problem. For example, are the nations of the world reacting appropriately to the dire threat of climate change? And if not, why not? Why are modern economies so deeply committed to a deeply perverse concept of progress? What's the nature of real wealth? Why have the benefits of technological society, which promise security and leisure for all, so completely failed to materialize? And what can we do about that? Do we most deeply desire disposable income or disposable time? Anders Hayden is the author of Sharing the Work, Sparing the Planet, and more recently, When Green Growth is Not Enough, Climate Change, Ecological Modernization, and Sufficiency. Your new research is on alternative ways of measuring progress. Is that?
Yeah, that's right. So in recent years, there's been a lot of criticism of GDP as a measure of progress and well-being. And of course, it was never actually intended as a measure of progress. It was a measure, originally, it was meant to be a measure of the volume of economic activity, which is not synonymous with progress or well-being. It was clearly not meant to be the case, according to Simon Kuznets, who was one of the key individuals involved in developing it. But it's come to be seen as a measure of how well we're doing as a society, how much we're advancing, and so on. And it's clearly very flawed as a measure of that kind. It doesn't take into account environmental considerations. GDP can be going up, leading to high levels of environmental destruction. It doesn't take into account inequality. So GDP in the United States has gone up quite dramatically since the early 70s. The median income hasn't gone up at all, and you see the impacts of that in the political debate today, the level of anger in the United States and the level of interest in people who are running against the establishment. But if you look at GDP alone, it looks like the country's getting better and better and better, with occasional recessions here and there, but on an upward trend. And so it's become clear that GDP is a flawed measure for a number of other reasons as well. So there have been a lot of different attempts to develop alternatives to GDP. And we've seen interest at that. It used to be that it was people on the green side of the political spectrum making these arguments, making the critique of GDP largely as a measure that doesn't take into account ecological considerations and sustainability. And you had people in green parties and environmentally minded academics and so on saying we needed alternatives to this. And more recently, we've seen that move into the mainstream, that kind of recognition of the limits of GDP. So, Nicolas Sarkozy, when he was president of France, commissioned a group led by Nobel laureates Joseph Stiglitz and Amartya Sen to look into alternatives to GDP. The OECD, or Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has been increasingly interested in alternative measurements, and it has its own Better Life Index. The European Union has a Beyond GDP initiative, or at least originally they started talking about Beyond GDP, then they changed it to GDP and Beyond, to just a slight change in the wording, but reflecting the fact that some people think this is about moving beyond GDP. Other people think of this as, well, it's still going to measure GDP, but we'll have some other measurements to go alongside it. In any case, there's been a lot of mainstream interest in this. In Britain, under David Cameron, they launched a national well-being measurement initiative with new surveys asking people in Britain how satisfied they are with their lives. So we've seen a proliferation of these initiatives around the world, and it's gotten to the point where we can now ask what impact, if any, are these alternative measurement systems having on policy and on political and social priorities. So that's what we're interested in looking at.
Now, you see, we've had enough experience with these that we can kind of measure the impact of the measurement, so to speak. Where does that go back? How far back can you go with that? Because Cameron's initiative is relatively new, Sarkozy also, right?
Yeah, no, so these are fairly recent. So in a sense, we're looking at the initial impacts, and so this is still something that's going to be playing out for some time. So my colleague Jeff Wilson and I are looking at the British case. We're looking at also at Canada, where we have a Canadian Index of Wellbeing that's produced by academics at the University of Waterloo. Also, there's been efforts there's a group here in Nova Scotia, GPI Atlantic, has also produced an alternative measurement system. And so but on Canada, the difference is that there's been no take-up of these measurements by any provincial government or the federal government. And so that's been a key limitation here. In other places, such as Britain, there's been high-level government interest, at least getting these measurements rolling, although that high-level interest hasn't necessarily always been sustained. We're also interested in looking at Maryland and Vermont in the United States, where at the state level, they've introduced GPI measures, genuine progress indicators at the state level. And then we're also in our research interested in looking at Bhutan, where they have a GNH index, a Gross National Happiness Index, which is actually relatively recent. It's been calculated since 2008, I believe. It's part of the wider Gross National Happiness philosophy in Bhutan. So we're starting to look at some of these relatively recent examples of places that are moving in this direction.
Now, we're right at the beginning of your research project on this, but you must have a hypothesis. What's your hypothesis about the impact of this?
Well, yeah, I don't know if I have it formulated as a clear hypothesis. I have a question about how interested into the degree to which this shift to new measurement systems the degree to which that is changing the social priorities, or the degree to which that is simply allowing some of the critique of the conventional model to be safely absorbed by dominant institutions. And I don't know what the answer to that is yet. So I mentioned earlier, it used to be the Greens, the radicals, who were critiquing GDP and saying we need alternatives. Now we have this much greater mainstream interest in it. And so the fact that you're getting this debate about how to measure progress, how to measure well-being, it opens up these possibilities to say, actually, we may have been on the wrong path. You know, maybe we've been prioritizing the wrong things. There are alternate opportunities here to make the case for, you know, a greater emphasis on ecological sustainability, on social equity, on considering the value of things that are not produced for a market price, the value of volunteer work, the value of all the unpaid work that goes on in households, you know, predominantly by women, to give greater value to that in society. So there's an opportunity here for that. There's also, I've been seeing that there's also attempts to narrow this agenda to something that's more about better policy making at the margins, you know, and this is some of the language that I heard a lot in Britain, you know, better policy at the margins. So getting some better information about well-being and how policy can change well-being so you can better spend you know, your available budget. So if you find out that, for example, a program that allows young people to volunteer in their communities, that it improves their personal well-being, that gives you a greater case to spend money on that program. And that can be useful. There's some usefulness to that, but there are some people who are, and some groups that I think are trying to confine it to relatively small-scale adjustments in what is being done with government budgets, and others who have a much more expansive, transformative agenda of trying to really reshape our social priorities, really question whether economic growth should be such a high-level priority, and you know, really wanting to put a greater emphasis on sustainability and equity and sustainable well-being as a priority as opposed to economic growth.
It's so you've basically got one group that's looking at this as giving them maybe a permit to tinker, right? And another group that says, no, we may have totally misunderstood what human life is all about by restricting it to dollars and cents, and to something which, I mean, the GDP, if crime goes up, GDP goes up. If pollution goes up, GDP goes up. Anything that causes money to be spent, right? And a lot of that is bad for it's the opposite of progress, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yes. And I suppose, you know, even with some of the tinkering, there are some interesting conclusions that could come out of it. So the more you look at well-being and what impacts people's well-being, it draws attention to issues such as social isolation and loneliness. We don't talk a lot about loneliness as a public policy priority, but if you actually look at where real problems in terms of well-being are, it's a lot of people who are in social isolation, elderly people that should be a much greater policy and public priority than it is. And so well-being measurement can draw your attention to that. So I think that's actually a significant thing that can come out of even the tinkering. But I'm interested in going beyond that. I'm sort of in the camp of those who think that we need to be thinking more fundamentally as well about the degree to which economic growth is our priority. I think that's maybe served us well for a certain period in time in terms of allowing us to increase economic output, but it's no longer a good, it was never really an ultimate, it never should have been an ultimate aim. It should only have been a means. And at this point, I think it's becoming destructive that prioritization of growth is having, destructive consequences in terms of directing us away from the things that we really need to be focused on today, which I think are issues of ecological sustainability and equity.
If I can quote Anders Hayden on this point, you had a wonderful line at one point about cutting down great forests in order to make disposable chopsticks. Right. And does this really improve our? And there's no way to measure the value of a forest in the existing, until it becomes disposable chopsticks or 2x4s. Mm-hmm. It doesn't enter the economic measurements system at all.
Yes, and that's the ecological economist Herman Daly has a concept related to that where he talks about uneconomic growth. So there are actually ways in which the GDP could be going up in ways that are resulting in a net destruction of things that have real value, things that may not be counted by the GDP but can be fundamentally more important.
Well, and I think that most thoughtful environmentalists would say that's quite a common situation, where, for example, the GDP goes up because you're destroying the codfish stocks. Are you better off at having destroyed the codfish stocks? Hardly, right?
Yeah.
So let me bring you back now to some of the earlier work, because you've been doing some comparative studies between Canada and the United Kingdom in particular, and a little more broadly than that, but that's been kind of a focus, and on their response to what they perceive of the economic or the ecological crisis that we're facing. Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, so this goes back to roughly my thinking on this started maybe about just under 10 years ago, thinking about the contrast between Britain and Canada at the time, and where Britain was starting to really embrace the need to take significant action on climate change. And it was there was a move beyond business as usual, move beyond the idea that we could just keep focusing on economic growth and the environmental issues will be secondary. There was a move towards trying to pursue what some people call ecological modernization or green growth, the idea that we need to address, we need to quickly move towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but it was framed in a way that we can do that at the same time as we continue to pursue economic growth. So Britain was moving in that direction. At the time, Canada was very much stuck in a business as usual approach, the idea that there's a very significant conflict between economic growth and environmental objectives, and the economic objectives have to take priority. And there's a third perspective on these issues that I also wanted to bring into it, and that's this green critique of growth, and the idea that, well, maybe that green growth idea, the GDP growth and the environment can go hand in hand, maybe that has some usefulness in the short term, but what about the idea of, do we really need that, to put such priority on economic growth? Do we really need to have endless growth of production and consumption? And so I was also interested in looking at that perspective and the degree to which it was coming into the political debate in the context of how we respond to climate change. And so I kind of set it up as a kind of three-way battle of ideas between this business as usual green growth and sufficiency perspective, the perspective that questions the infinite growth of production and consumption.
That there is such a thing as enough, right?
Yes.
And because inherent in the whole idea of growth, be it green or otherwise, is the notion that there's never such a thing as enough, right? That you just keep on going infinitely. And and I think the question of, is that true? Is that reasonable? It's a profound question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think there's so there's been an attempt in a way to sort of sidestep the question And there's been a lot of effort to try to decouple those two things, to decouple economic growth from environmental impact, so that the GDP can keep growing, and we get our environmental impacts down at the same time. And that's become the way in which business and governments that take environmental issues seriously, and a fairly significant part of the environmental movement. It's a way in which they have coalesced around a project to address these issues. And I think there's something valuable and important about that project in enabling greater movement to address environmental issues. It has some value in terms of, for example, we do need to build up certain sectors of the economy, the renewable energy sector, and there are important political coalitions that can be created amongst green-oriented businesses, workers in those sectors, governments that want to see action on these issues. And there's some important value in that. At the same time, I think that approach doesn't always go far enough, because there's not always a technological solution to every environmental problem. You can't always come up with a way to simply get more ecologically efficient and have your environmental impacts come down, even as your economic output is going up. And a key example of that is in Canada with our oil sands, tar sands sector. We don't have a good technological solution. We've been stuck, we've been putting forward this economic project of rapidly expanding the oil sands, trying to extract as much as possible from that resource. And that would be all fine and good if there were technological solutions to the environmental problems it's generating, but we actually don't have adequate solutions. There's no way right now to see significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in that sector at the same time as you expand that sector. So that puts the question about how much is enough. In that case, how much is enough with regard to that particular sector, with regard to that particular resource? And so I think we need to be asking that question with regard to particular sectors of the economy, as well as asking how much is enough more generally in terms of economic growth as a whole and our level of consumerism and consumption.
And then there's this other phenomenon that you talk about that I think is a fascinating and in a sense, for me anyway, a sort of a late emerging concern, where you say, okay, if we get to the point where we can produce more with less environmental impact, you would think then the environmental impact would go down. But in fact, it often goes up.
Yes.
Tell us about that. Tell me about that.
Well, I guess there are sort of two things. If your impact per unit of production is going down, but your number of units of production is going up at an even faster pace, you'll find yourself further behind rather than further ahead. And so that the oil sands is a good example of that. They can point to statistics where their emissions per barrel of output have gone down by, say, roughly 30% in the past 20, 25 years. But their total emissions have skyrocketed because their output has gone up so much more. So that's one part of the problem. There's also something called the rebound effect. When we get more efficient, well, that saves us money. So we, say, use less energy per, for our heating, in our automobiles or any other energy use. We don't need as much energy as before to do what we were doing before, so we have more money in our wallets. And what do we do when we have more money in our wallets? Well, we spend it on something else, which tends to require more energy. So there are cases where you can actually have more energy consumption, ultimately resulting in even more, you have energy efficiency that can in some cases lead to more energy consumption than you started with. That's not always the case. It's going to depend, context, case-by-case basis, depending on the context. But at the very least, we get a less bang for our buck out of efficiency than we think, because we lose some of the environmental gains once, the savings, our monetary savings, are spent on something else. So those kind of phenomena raise the importance of that question again of how much is enough. It's important to be more efficient, but if we're only focused on efficiency without sufficiency is going to be limited in terms of the environmental improvement that comes out of it.
So let's go back to the original Canada-UK comparison in that tripartite, the three ideas that are battling with each other. If you have Canada representing, broadly speaking, business as usual, the UK representing the green growth example, what represents sufficiency?
Well, there isn't necessarily, a country that represents it, although we may talk about more of this, maybe Bhutan does to some degree. That's a little bit more, an interesting case in itself. I think I wouldn't say that there's any one country per se that represents that, but there are different ways in which those ideas are they're kind of percolating their way into the debate, but facing a lot of obstacles. So, we talked about one example of that earlier when we were talking about the alternatives to GDP as a measure of well-being and progress. That's one way in which that growth critique is making some headway into mainstream political debate today. Right? There are other specific examples. So, for example, in Britain there was a proposal going back to the Labour government to build a third runway at Heathrow. And the environmental movement did a lot of work to show that unlimited expansion of aviation in Britain was going to very quickly run into, it was going to lead to excessive emissions growth that was going to make it very difficult, if not impossible, for Britain to meet its emissions reductions targets. And they were able to show that you couldn't continue on that path of growth at the same time, if you were really committed to reducing your greenhouse gas emissions. So that the growth of that particular sector, of the aviation sector, came under a lot of criticisms from the environmental movement. And that criticism, along with some other political calculations by by David Cameron and the Conservative Party, actually led to the Cameron government cancelling the third runway at Heathrow when it came to power. So that's an example where a movement, an environmental thinking driven by those sufficiency concerns, actually were able to put a stop to a major project. It's also an example of the challenges with this sufficiency way of thinking. When you do have victories of that kind, they also tend to be fragile. Because that idea, for example, has come back. It's back on the table. There's been talk about getting that third runway built again. If it doesn't happen at Heathrow, it might happen at Gatwick, and so on. So these battles continually have to be refought because the forces behind growth, the forces in that particular sector that want to see that airport expand and want to see the aviation industry expand, those forces are quite strong. But that is an example where, a particular example where some of this sufficiency-oriented thinking actually won an important victory.
Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't mean to suggest that there was necessarily a country that would represent that, but I think there's a certain difficulty in getting people to wrap their heads around the idea that we're going to have a variation of the present arrangement where we're committed to growth, but we're going to do it in a more green fashion, or we're going to start measuring as growth things that don't involve physical activities, for example. I mean, what you and I do for a living generally doesn't cause a huge amount of emissions. If we do more of it, it doesn't, it doesn't increase our emissions. Yeah. So there's some way to imagine some of that. But my suspicion is that the average person, having followed us thus far in the conversation, would be saying, but what happens to me if the sufficiency argument wins the day? Yeah. Do I now all of a sudden am I now not able to take a plane? The sense is maybe this is one of loss, and then it becomes politically unsaleable, right?
Yeah. Well, and so there are a lot of political challenges with that perspective. So and aviation is probably one of the toughest cases, because there's a lot of value from getting on a plane and having new experience. So that's kind of a tough case to sell politically, and it's so that's one reason also why the environmental movement tends to shy away from from that kind of politics. There are some other examples that are maybe easier but less important environmentally. So you see some more symbolic types of measures, say, and I don't want to dismiss them as unimportant, but they certainly have less environmental impact. Things like plastic bags, in terms of, from a climate perspective. There's been some political efforts in Britain. There were moves to reduce plastic bags, and it was even when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, he was framing that as part of his climate agenda. And I think we have a sense that there's a huge excess in the amount which we use these things. There's billions of these things used every year in a country like Canada or Britain. So it's a very strong symbol of excess and something we could use less of. We don't have to use so many things. And that's the kind of thing, so that's quite easy to imagine having fewer of these things. There's easy alternatives to it. It doesn't change our way of life. But that, well, I guess it depends on some of these issues. It depends on, you can get to the same issue or point from different starting points. I mean, you could, in that sense, questioning something like the plastic bag doesn't involve questioning the economy as economic growth as a whole, and certainly believers in green growth could be on side with that type of measure. Other people who are asking these questions about sufficiency might also support that as a very specific way to raise the question of how much is enough. Say, there's just a lot of excess here that we can do without. So I think you can get to that from different starting points.
Well, there's a bit of a continuum. Once you reject business as usual, you've got the green growth camp and the sufficiency camp. And it's not an either or, is it? It's a kind of a continuum. Yeah. But part of what it seems, what I'm getting from your work, is the need to redefine wealth, the need to redefine what it is that makes a good life. What's it for? What's it all about? And the answer in the market economies has tended to be, it's about more money. But we know now that isn't. Well, we've always known. If you've got cancer, or if your wife has left you, or if your dog has died, that matters far more than the price of gasoline to you, right?
Yes, yeah. So that's right. And I think that sufficiency perspective also needs its own positive vision, and people have been, working on that, and the evidence that shows that once people reach a certain level of material consumption and basic needs are met, the link between higher incomes and well-being is not particularly strong. There's an academic debate on this going on. Some people say there is no link after a certain point. Other people say there's still some link. If it does exist, it actually becomes relatively weak after a certain point. You need, quite huge increases in income to get relatively small increases in well-being beyond a certain point. And there are other ways to increase well-being that have far less environmental impact. So, things that really matter to people, the quality, the quality of their relationships, the quality of their friendships, the level to which having an additional friend that you can count on, that gives you a huge increase in well-being. If you think about the amount of money you would need, additional money you would need to give you that same increase in well-being, that additional friend is worth a lot. And things like our sense of, the strength of our communities, the sense of trust we have in our neighbors, these are very important drivers of well-being. And part of that sufficiency agenda, I think, is also about opening up time, so that people are less stressed, they're less, they're not working such long hours. Having more time as an alternative to endless consumption growth, I think, is also one important part of this agenda.
Now this takes us back to your first book, right, which was about work time reduction. Yeah. And you made the interesting point there that through much of the history of industrial capitalism, what the labor movement was all about was getting those kinds of things, more vacation, more benefits, more. It wasn't about money, it wasn't about higher wages, it was about these other issues, and particularly about work time. And that you started, that you had an 80-hour work week, for example, and the labor movement was really strong on trying to get it down. That seems to have stopped. Why is that?
Yes, well, I think the labor movement certainly focused very heavily on hours of work reduction. I think they had a balanced, generally a fairly balanced approach historically. There was also the interest in certainly increasing hourly wages and material standard of living, but it wasn't just about bread, it was bread and roses too. It was also about the quality of life and having time for, a dignified human life, having time to be, time for leisure, having time for one's family, having time to be involved in one's community. Those were all important aspects of a labor movement vision, and it is still an idea that's some people within the labor movement are still promoting and still talking about, but it's definitely been downplayed. I guess there are different steps along the way. I think in North America, the push towards shorter hours of work definitely became a lot weaker after the Second World War. It coincides roughly with the time period in which there was a big cultural push towards consumerism. It also coincides with the time period in which GDP becomes the dominant indicator. And if you look at it in GDP terms, yes, more work and more consumption is better than more time, because more work and more consumption shows up in the GDP figures. If people actually are having time to enjoy their lives and spending adequate time with their friends and getting involved in their communities, that counts for nothing in the GDP. So it's another example of the problems with GDP. But it's in that sort of Second World War time period in North America that the labor movement starts to drift away from the hours of work agenda, more so, especially in the United States, even more so than in Canada. And the emphasis comes to be on income growth and consumption growth. Now, in more recent years, the labor movement's been even more on the defensive. It's weaker than it was, and so a lot of what it's fighting for is just to hold on to what it had before. Protecting jobs, keeping wages, protecting pensions. So it's become more difficult, I think, for the labor movement to push for a vision of that kind. That said, I think it still deserves to be part of the labor movement agenda, and one of the ways in which it can potentially revitalize itself as a key force as we move into a more ecologically minded era.
I'm struck by an illustration, I think in the first book, which showed somebody with a placard saying, "Help us to achieve more the reduction of hours at the same pay."
Yes.
And obviously making a choice, saying, if we have a choice of advancing in terms of dollars, we would rather, in this moment, choose more time. And that was a perspective that really seemed to be a big part of the European understanding of how the labor movement should go forward, and how legislation about working hours and so on and so forth should be framed. No?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and certainly there was a continued movement towards shorter hours of work, even for a longer time period in the European context, where in the 80s and 1990s, the German trade unions were pushing for a 35-hour week, or in some cases less, and France moved towards a 35-hour week, and Denmark moved to a 6th week paid vacation. Think about that. The 6th week paid vacation, everyone had 5 before that, and they actually had a national strike for the demand for the 6th week paid vacation. And it was interesting to hear sort of some of at the time the workers being interviewed in the press and saying, I have a good income, but what I want is more time to spend with my family in the summers, and so that's certainly been part of that also of the labor movement agenda there. I think in what's happened in recent years, there's been more of an individualization of these options, whereas before it was more of a collective demand for a reduced work week for everyone, or increased hours of work for everyone. There's been, as in society more generally, there's been a drift towards individualization, and so it's been a little harder to get large-scale support behind those demands for everyone's hours being reduced. Although you have seen some interesting moves towards more individual options, which I think also need to be considered. So, for example, in the Netherlands, there is a right under legislation. You have the right to reduce your hours of work. So, if you as an individual say, I would like more time rather than money, I'm prepared to go from a 5-day week to a 4-day week, I'm prepared to take 4 days pay for it with prorated benefits, then you have the right to make that request, and your employer has to give it to you, unless they can show it's not possible for the company. And so I think that also is interesting as a model to open up individual choices for people who are in a position to say, I don't need that money, but what I really want is time.
Well, much more difficult, I think, to make the argument for large numbers of people when we no longer have the model of the big mill with large numbers of employees. I mean, in that case, you know, there's an obvious constituency for that can benefit from acting together. But when you now have a situation where it's much smaller companies and much smaller workforces, yeah, the individual thing seems to work. Let me push this in one other direction, though, because your mention of Denmark and the sixth week of vacation. I mean, that's lovely. That's so Danish in a way, you know. But when I was in Denmark at one point, I was talking to a teacher, and I said, "What do you pay for income tax here?" And she said 65%, and I said 65%. And she said, "Yes, but I think it's a good deal." She said, "You look at what I get for that, you know, and I've got, you know, first-rate unemployment insurance, I've got the clear and free medical care, free pharmacare, I've got free tuition and education, all that kind of thing, grants and subsistence while I'm going to school." And she listed off all these things. And she said, so in the end, you know, if my housing is taken care of, my health is taken care of, my education is taken care of, and I've got plenty of leisure time, why do I need a lot of money? You know, in a sense, my money only has to deal with the relatively small part of my life that remains after these large things are already dealt with. And she obviously felt enormous satisfaction in that. I've thought about that, and this is the question I wanted to pursue with you, that it seems to me that what she's got is a great reduction in anxiety.
Yes.
And I think anxiety has gotten, as I've started to think about some of these issues, I think this is the most anxious society, and we're anxious partly because we don't have the sufficiency supports that we've just been talking about.
Yes, and that's right. And I think a lot of it, that sense of, you talk about anxiety, insecurity, economic insecurity, that's can be a very powerful force in terms of driving people to, if you fear for the future, you feel a need to, work as much as you can now, accumulate as much as you can now, because you fear for the future. You don't know what's going to be there.
If I don't have a great pension plan,
well,
then I better save a lot of money.
That's right, and we have seen growing levels of economic insecurity as these supports have been reduced, and certainly, and as for many people have seen their hourly wages stagnate or in some cases decline, it becomes, in those kind of situations, very hard, if not impossible, to imagine that people are going to want shorter hours of work. They're going to want to be able to get what they can in terms of money to be able to make sure to try and address those concerns about insecurity. And I think that actually that idea of economic security is important. If we think about, okay, what is the alternative to the focus on growth? And economic security rather than growth, I think, deserves to be a big part of what the alternative is. And some people, we've often put forward growth as the solution to the security problem, but I think they're actually not really the same thing. And you can have an approach that tries to aim for maximum growth, but ends up taking a lot of risks. So if you look at the risks that were taken in the financial sector, prior to the crash, this was, unleashing unleashing the financial sector and had this potential to lead to these great financial payoffs, but it also put us all at a great deal of risk. And being more cautious, having an approach to economics that is less about trying to maximize output, but trying to avoid booms and busts, avoiding those recessions where people lose a great deal. I think that deserves to be a key part of an alternative agenda. So more emphasis on economic security rather than maximum growth. One of the other things about the well-being literature, it shows that unemployment is very damaging to well-being. So we certainly need to have a strong priority to jobs and good quality jobs. But we also very much have to put a strong emphasis on avoiding recessions. Okay, so having a much more stable economy is definitely part of the agenda, but that's not necessarily the maximum growing economy, because again, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen the type of economy that was unleashed in terms of a lot of risks, a lot of potential payoffs, but also when when things go badly, there's a lot of people pay the price, and
There's a whole complex of things that are tied up together here that I think take a little sorting out. But the measurement by GDP, the emphasis on economic growth, the emphasis on long hours of work to get money as opposed to shorter hours of work to get other things. That's all kind of one complex ball of values that are very limited to economic terms. Seems to me that the positive value of sufficiency has to be in articulating a vision of a way of life which has lower anxiety, probably has lower income. Well, like my Danish school teacher, right, who's paying a lot more for in taxes, but she's getting a security and a satisfaction and offering time to herself and ways to develop herself and so forth. She's getting a much richer life, right? And somehow it seems to me that the change needs to articulate that too, so that people say, okay, another fact from one piece of your writing, that a worker in 14th century Britain worked about 1,440 hours a year. A worker in 1988 in the United States, 1856, 400 hours. That's 10 full weeks longer that we're working in this advanced society than we were in the Middle Ages. Right? And maybe even more if you go back to hunters and gatherers, who you were pointing out that some of them got by on 15 hours a week. So. Yeah.
Yes, so that comes back to that notion of sufficiency and how much is enough. What are your traditional needs? And that was one of the key elements. One of the interesting elements of the pre-modern period was that there was a sense of limits to what people needed, and they at the time, if you paid somebody more, they would. Today, economists would say you pay somebody a higher wage, you'll get more labor output from them. But in pre-modern societies, you pay somebody more, they just work less because they can get what they need in less time, right? And that kind of cultural norm of sufficiency was broken, it was smashed as we moved into the modern world. But I think it is something that is important to get back to.
And it's still there, except we don't articulate it very much. I mean, like the research you've mentioned, where people's well-being increases in lockstep with their income up to the point where they're sufficiently, there's that word again, but sufficiently well-fed, well-dressed, well-housed, and so forth. And then after that, the two of them, they may not diverge entirely, but they certainly, as you said earlier, you have to start getting a lot more money to get a little more well-being. Right? So we know that, don't we? We already sort of instinctively understand that we need money, or we need income to get to a certain level of satisfactory lifestyle, but beyond that, not so much.
Yeah, and I think part of this is also we need a cultural effort to try and revalue other areas in society. And I have a friend who's in management, and I went to the art gallery with him for an event once, and we were watching the performance. And he turned to me and he said, "I don't know what the point of this is. I don't know how you monetize this." and I he's my friend, but I almost had to hold back from calling him a barbarian, because it just seems to me this is absolutely backwards. That the point of money, the point of wealth, is so then you can do things in the realm of culture, beyond the realm of necessity. And we have a backwards society where we try to make the case for the arts, we try to make the case for music, we try to make the case for all these things that are, profoundly meaningful and valuable in themselves. But we have to convince people that they're going to have an economic payoff. To teach music in the schools today, to keep those programs alive, you have to convince, the powers that be that students will have higher earnings down the road because they've developed certain, mental skills through music, rather than seeing music in itself as something valuable. And so I think we need this cultural effort to try and, somebody put it as, looked at it in terms of, if you think about sort of the audio dials, if you have a sound system with the various different features that you can turn up and down, and we have the economic side of society turned up to the maximum. And we have, the other sides of it, in the cultural realm, and, all the realms outside of work, all the realms outside of money making are, turned down at very low levels. And I think we need to dampen down the economic level and then start turning up some of these other, spheres in society.
And in a sense, that's about the chattering classes and measurements and sort of social noise, high-level social noise. But in our own lives and in the lives of the communities that we're part of, we know that's not true, right? I mean, our experience is that we don't listen to music because it has an economic payback. We listen to it because it does something for our souls and spirits, right? Let me go back to the work time reduction, because you had some calculations about the impact of this, or some thoughts about the impact of this ecologically.
Yeah, certainly with all the income and the production and consumption, it carries with it, very significant, material needs, energy needs, and that you see that in terms of ecological footprint, higher ecological footprints from a production and consumption-oriented vision of well-being. So shifting away, shifting in a different direction offers I think a important alternative that can benefit both well-being and in terms of reduced ecological impacts. And I worked on a paper with a colleague of mine, just looking, for example, at comparing ecological footprints of countries in terms of their hours of work, and it shows quite clearly that countries that have higher average hours of work have significantly higher ecological footprints. In large part, that's because those countries are choosing longer hours of work, more consumption, more output, whereas others with shorter hours of work are choosing higher quality of life in other ways, more time, rather than more income and production. And so that choice, whether on an individual level or even more importantly on a national level, has real differences in terms of ecological impacts.
Which brings us back to your argument about sufficiency, that ultimately the problem may not be green growth or other kinds of growth, the problem may be growth.
Yes, I find it hard in the long run to think that we're going to address these problems when we're so committed to growth. And I think there are various, you might be able to imagine, I guess you can't say this with absolute certainty. I'm skeptical that we can address the climate problem without confronting the growth paradigm. But you might be able to imagine that we could, by throwing everything we've got at technological solutions and a rapid shift to renewable energy, that we might be able to address that problem and avoid, stay within 2 degrees of warming and hopefully closer to 1.5 degrees, and still do that within a growth paradigm. I'm skeptical of that, but maybe it's possible. But then we've got a whole other set of environmental problems as well to consider, and it's not just about climate change. There's biodiversity challenges. We've disrupted, the nitrogen cycle. We're already beyond critical thresholds, in regards to those areas. And there are other environmental problems to confront. So I think it's fairly hard to imagine that we're going to not only address climate change, but address all these other challenges without addressing that, without addressing that growth paradigm. I don't think we're going to do it with 9 billion people and ever expanding consumption standards, and to be able to address the full suite of problems.
And I'm struck by the other end. I'm struck by the fact that I once had the radical thought that the economy represents a mechanism for turning the planet into junk, because what we consume becomes garbage. Like 99% of it. I think this is literally the case, that 99% of what we buy is in the dump within 6 months.
Yeah.
And so now we have a huge garbage problem.
Yes.
And you can't get rid of that and you can't keep on growing the plastics industry and not have what we're having in the oceans, for example, these vast islands of floating garbage. Right?
Yeah, and then the other side of that, then you mentioned, a lot of what we purchase in 6 months in the dump, and then you think about, well, how much of your life energy did you give up to pay for that thing that's now in the dump 6 months later? And that gets back to the question of, do we need as much as we need, and could we actually live with less consumption, but actually free up a lot of time for other more meaningful things that really contribute to our well-being.
Oh, yeah, and leave a habitable planet for our children. Right?
That's right.
Somewhere in something you wrote, you were talking about something that sheds some real light on what we've been through for the last 10 years in Canada, and one of the real resistance points, which is, there literally are people out there who will say that the destruction of the planet is a good thing because it leads to the rapture.
In the American context, I mean, something like climate change is it's a fairly important, fairly fundamental challenge to certain stories that have been told. I mean, you have this idea of this society that's been blessed by God with abundance, and you have, an American way of freewheeling capitalism that, and for some people is God's way in their framing of it. And then we're being told that, wait a minute, this is leading to ecological destruction, this is threatening God's creation. How do people put that together? Well, some people see that and say, okay, well, maybe it's up to us to actually, if you're a real Christian, then maybe you should be more concerned about stewardship and protecting God's creation. But others take it in other directions, and either will deny the science and say this can't be true, or if they acknowledge that it's true, they might, as you said, frame it as the sign of the end times and the sign of the rapture coming, and it's all been foretold in Scripture.
Yeah, that's a very difficult mindset to deal with, it seems to me, because everything that you challenge it with becomes the proof of its accuracy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I certainly don't have any magic solution for how to challenge that. I know there are some evangelical Christians who are climate scientists who have actually been trying to engage in those communities and try and, frame it in terms that they can understand and appeal to people in their own terms, and to get them to take a different approach to it. And I think that's, I think that's heroic work that some people in that area are doing.
Anders Hayden on the changes we need to make in ourselves and our societies to deal with the changes we're already causing in the climate. If you found this interview stimulating, you may want to see our interviews with Gwen Dyer, author of Climate Wars, and with James Lovelock, who believes we may already have irreparably damaged the intricate balance of forces that sustains our living Earth. For The Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. Come see us again.